I'm Rob Tracinski. This is Salon of the Refused, where we talk about ideas that are outside the mainstream. My guest today is Bob Garmong, who is a former lecturer at Dongbei University of Finance and Economics in China, and is now a consultant on education and immigration in China. You told me the city, and I can't remember it. Thanks for coming on, Bob.
It doesn't matter. It's a tiny little city of less than 1 million people.
Oh, less than 1 million is tiny in China, yes.
Yes, that's like the 50th on the list of Chinese cities, yeah.
However,
it does have 3,000 years of history. So if I walk out my front door, I can walk 5 minutes to a park where there's a battlement that was constructed in the 1300s.
Wow.
So,
well,
we've got some history
I'm coming
here.
to you from a little tiny town in Virginia that has maybe 40 people. So it's a little different. But so the first thing I'm going to ask, I'm going to talk to you about what's going on in China and your experience there and what you've learned about Chinese society and specifically where it's headed in the current environment. But let's start at the beginning. What brought you to China? How is it that you came there?
Well, I was basically a failed academic.
Well, you were in the adjunct track. I mean, this is not an unusual thing, by the way,
Right.
There's a lot of, it's one of the big stories of academia in the last 10, 20 years. We were all told, I know you and I were in college together, we were told at the time, oh, it's going to be great. All the old baby boomers are going to retire. There are going to be all these jobs for you that are coming up. And then what actually happened is, the jobs were jobs for...
We were lured into a honey trap.
Yes, and the jobs ended up being, well, you get an adjunct job where you get no pay, no security, no benefits, and you can get fired, and basically, next semester you can be out on the streets and be fired. And the tenure track positions are few and far between and are dwindling in a way, at least in the humanities.
Right, they can hire 3 adjuncts for what they pay 1 tenured professor. So why would anyone hire a tenured professor anymore?
Exactly.
So yes, I was on the adjunct treadmill for quite some time, including I actually have a published article on my time teaching at the Lunenburg minimum security prison in Virginia, which it was. I never thought I would go to prison for philosophy in the United States, but so I happened to have a contact who knew people in the Chinese higher education field, and that person broadcast my CV to 100 different universities, and I managed to get a really, what for Chinese academia was truly a plum job at Dongbei University of Finance and Economics, teaching business ethics, which China sorely needs, and European civilization, and even occasionally they would throw me a bone and let me teach a straight-up philosophy class. So I was teaching things like the moral foundations of capitalism at a Chinese government-run university. So, I mean, money to the side. The pure irony was fuel enough for me.
And it really was symptomatic of a time when, for the last couple of decades, when China was so eager for integration with the West, for ideas coming in from the West, for figuring out what is it the West has been doing that we need to learn from.
I came here in 2009, just in the wake of the Beijing Olympics. And at that time, they had made a big demonstration of opening up. In order to get the Olympics in the first place, they had to promise all sorts of things about civil rights and unimprisoning dissidents and so on, that then they began slowly ratcheting back shortly after I came here. But at that time, yes, it was absolutely opening up, and it was very definitely on a path, what seemed like a path toward greater and greater liberty, liberalism, in my sense of liberalism, freedom, intellectual freedom, and economic freedom. And then, unfortunately, I think the economic catastrophe in the West had terrible impact on China. not so much in the economic sphere, but in their own idea of themselves. Because suddenly the United States was seen to be stumbling, and China relatively, at least on the surface, weathered it well. And so they began to see themselves as not so much needing us foreign devils anymore.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they reclaimed their kind of rightful position as the Middle Kingdom in some ways.
And that brings me to let's talk a little bit then about what's going on now, because that's my sense too, that there was the idea that the American model or the Western model was something they needed to emulate. And now there's more the idea that, oh, no, we don't need that. We don't need to take any lessons from that. And we're going to go back in a different direction. And now you have, under Xi Jinping, you have, he's gotten rid of the sort of rule by committee that they had, where no one person was supremely powerful, and now he's supremely powerful. So it's one-man rule back at the top levels of the Communist Party. He's bringing back the cult of personality. I saw somebody was measuring what they were measuring mentions of Xi in the newspapers and in the media in China, and there's this upward graph, that's steeply upward graph, and of course that's not a coincidence. That's happening because people are being told to do it. And things like Xi Jinping thought. He has a thought that's named after him, like Mao Zedong thought.
Whatever it is, no one can quite figure out what it is. Exactly. By the way, if I can interrupt, just pet peeve, it's really pronounced Xi, but G is totally wrong. Oh, okay. That actually means chicken in Chinese. Which maybe I should adopt, but...
I appreciate the correction. I mean, I sort of feel free to mispronounce French words, but just to irk the French. But I'll try to be a little more careful. Okay, so it's more like Xi Jinping?
Right.
Okay. I'll try to get that a little more.
You're in good company, though. I constantly swear at the announcers and moderators on all the major networks, who are paid, I'm sure, a whole lot more than you are to mispronounce Chinese words.
It's the thing, though, that we're talking about the Olympics. It's the one thing I always admire about Bob Costas. People think he's a little smug and all that, but the one thing he did is he actually went out and memorized how to properly pronounce the names of all these obscure athletes from all these different countries, and he would know how to pronounce the names. And that's a skill. And
there's deep respect in that, which is why it does kind of become a pet peeve of mine. But anyway, so you can edit this part out.
No, that's fine. I'll probably keep this in. Anyway, so Xi Jinping is coming back and giving this sort of cult of personality, and he has his own thought named after him, and it's much more sort of almost nostalgically hearkening back to the old-fashioned communism of Mao.
It is and it isn't. And now, what brought me to China in the first place, I could have gone other places. I wasn't that hard up. But China seemed at the time to have tremendous promise. There's a lack of Christian heritage. There's a lack of that kind of notion of sacrifice and altruism. There's a tremendous idea of productiveness and enterprising. I don't want to use the word capitalism for it, but enterprising business, entrepreneurship, and so on.
I think entrepreneurialism would maybe be the term, that it's an enterprising people who are used to forming businesses, and
Yeah. And there's of course, a complete lack of political correctness here, which is quite refreshing, as we've discussed in a previous conversation. And there's a real spirit of innovation in China. So it's not true communism that they're trying to bring back, but it is those aspects of Maoism that were the totalitarianism and the cult of personality are really coming back. So the most, I think, emblematic thing was when Xi Jinping, in the last People's Congress, got himself the real two plums. Number one, as you mentioned, Xi Jinping thought has now been enshrined in the Constitution of China. So it's now unconstitutional to disagree with Xi Jinping. Although, as we can discuss later, there's no clear definition of what the hell that actually means. And number two, previously there had been a term limit. So the Chinese premier serves for a 5-year term, and then a second 5-year term. And then it was capped. You were out after 10 years. He got that eliminated. So he will be the emperor for life, really.
And as I understand the system, that there's usually this like council of 10 people at the top, and there's always another person sort of waiting in the wings to take over power next. And he sort of,
that's right.
He got that council of 10 replaced with basically his yes men and retainers and people who were not competition for him.
That's right. And they would typically, there were always, of course, factions. You know, in the U.S. we have our political parties. In China, those are all repressed. But everybody, and they were more in personal terms. You know, you're in the Hu Jintao faction.
Right.
Or you're in this or that faction. And in the past, they would deliberately put one person from the other faction on that council so that there was at least some element of power sharing. And that has been completely eliminated. So yes, that has been a radical change from, and that's been that old system has been the case since 1970s. 1979
right.
was when Deng Xiaoping took power.
And that's what I have to ask, which is, are the Chinese crazy? Because, you know, they put the system in place because of the experience with Mao, because of the experience of having one guy who was so supreme that he had this unaccountable power. And, you know, this is something I noticed about the history of communism in Russia after Stalin, is that the first people to rebel against totalitarianism were not the poor oppressed dissidents. The first people to want to back off from full totalitarianism were the party elites. Because under Stalin, if you were a party elite, that didn't protect you from getting sent to the gulag or being executed or, you know, having to confess and then be executed. And the same thing under Mao, being a party elite, you know, Deng Xiaoping, wasn't he sent off to work in a factory for a while and, you know, sent into exile, and people were punished and killed and reprisals on them, even when they were among the elites. So the first thing the elite does as the first sign of opening up is they say, well, we're going to back off from full totalitarianism, keep one overarching guy with all the power to protect us from that power. And then it becomes something that then spreads out from there. So,
right. So we'll keep the filibuster in the Senate because although we have power today, you might have power tomorrow, and we'll want it then.
Right. So why are they willing to let this happen again? Is it this because it's so long in the past they don't remember it?
Oh, first of all, the Chinese forget nothing. So to put that idea out of your head, I mean, they're still reliving the Nanjing massacre. So no. However, and there are a bunch of different ideas there. Number one key thing about the Chi-Coms, even in the days of communism. And by the way, another pet peeve of mine, I do not regard China as a communist country, although it's ruled by the Communist Party. You understand that it is technically it's fascism, not communism. They don't like that word, but even when it was communist, they always had a different policy from the Stalinists. And in the history of the Chinese Communist Party, when you fell out of power, you went into house arrest, you got spirited away. There was only one person, Lin Biao, who was likely killed. And there were a couple who were killed not by party apparatchiks, but by the Red Guards during the troubles in the 60s. And that was shocking and horrifying, and that really ended the Cultural Revolution. So they always had a much smarter policy than Stalin did, which was a soft landing for your opposition.
I see. They just got pushed out of power or maybe exiled off to some little town somewhere.
Typically, yeah. Right. It of course wasn't universal, but yes. So they were smarter about that sort of thing. So that's one key element. The other thing is that they actually made very, very careful study of the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, it didn't escape their attention that the other main communist power of the world had lost power and basically collapsed. So during the 1990s, there was a major industry of Chinese academicians under government support going to government-run think tanks. And by the way, Beijing has more think tanks than the entire rest of the world combined. You just never hear about them because they're all government-sponsored and secret.
And they do work that goes within the government and not out to the public.
That's right. It's not, you don't get to publish those things, but they are there, and they are very, very actively studying. And the main lesson that they drew from the fall of the Soviet Union was that Gorbachev made the key mistake of opening up when he allowed rival factions to publicly oppose his policies as the downfall of the Soviet Union. So from that moment forward, of course, they'd already had Tiananmen Square in 1989, so they already had this idea that we must have supreme power. Mm-hmm. But from 1991 forward, the idea of any real opposition to the Communist Party was absolutely dead. It was not possible in this country. So they actually would throw your question back at you and say, no, we're the true students of history because we realize once you open up, then you cause chaos. And Xi Jinping came in with a couple of key problems. One big problem was corruption. And that's, of course, right? We see it in the United States with Solyndra and so on. And we have such a negligible government component of our economy compared to the Chinese.
Right.
So here, corruption is absolutely rampant. It's endemic. It's every adjective that you can throw at it. And she saw that as the primary threat to Communist Party control in China. And so he saw his first mandate as getting control over the Communist Party elites, all the way down to the local governments. And there's an old saying in China, which is one of my favorites. It goes back to imperial days. The mountains are high and the emperor is far away. Which represents the idea that whatever the emperor may say in whatever great policy he may have in mind, we locals are going to do whatever we care to do. And that has always been the case in China. Mm-hmm. And she wanted to eliminate that as much as he possibly could. So a lot of his consolidation of power.
That's not just a Chinese idea, because one of the cases made for the French monarchy and for an absolute monarch was you have to have a strong monarchy so that the monarch is strong enough and powerful enough to control all the other government officials and keep them in line.
That's right. That's right.
And that's sort of standard for a society steeped in corruption and steeped in sort of unaccountable power. How do you get accountability? Well, one way is you can create a democratic system with a free press and where you have people who are able to check the power of the elites and criticize the elites. But the other way is, no, we don't need to do all that.
What kind of crazy talk is that?
Well, the other alternative to that is, no, you make one guy so powerful that he's going to, on behalf of the people, he's going to use his power to control the elites. And that's what they're doing with Xi.
And still in China to this day, if people are upset about their government, typically their view is that it's the local guy who's the problem. If only the people in Beijing knew what this bastard was doing, they would fix it. And they still will trek to Beijing to file their protests. And then maybe never go home again. But there's still that idea that, yeah, the government in Beijing, they really care about me. It's my local guy who's skimming the money for the roads, and so putting it in his pocket and so on. So yeah, there's definitely that idea that we need an iron strong central government in order to keep the locals in check. And also there's an idea in China that the number one value is stability. We do not want, and we absolutely fear, chaos. And again, that in 2009, 2008, they looked at the United States and saw chaos. They look at the United States today and see chaos.
Right.
And so it allows the Chinese then to turn away from this idea that we should emulate the West in any way and say we need more state control, more repression, more stability from the top.
Well, I think I kind of understand that historically because, we think of China as being this unchanging system, but if you look back, prior to 1949, it was chaos for quite some time. And it's almost like they have their obsession with stability is this pathological fear of returning to that point of being divided and chaotic and weak as they see it.
That's right. And we have the immediate history since 1842 with the First Opium War, but even going back throughout history, China has always, from the very first dynasties, has always had this sort of, and again, I think this is almost a physical law. You've got this intense control that then becomes corrupt and then reaches a tipping point when you get true chaos, and then all hell breaks loose. So they really don't want that to happen. If there's a way to avoid that tipping point, of course, when the tipping point comes, then everybody's in the streets and the dynasty is overthrown and somebody comes in with what they call the mandate of heaven. To throw out the old guys. But that's not just the last 150 years. It goes all the way back thousands of years through Chinese history.
Well, and that's fascinating to me because we were talking offline before the recording began about how American conservatism or the American right is unusual because it's conservative, but it's going back to a pro-freedom position. And really, the American Revolution was this strange thing of a revolution made by people who were trying to preserve the existing order as they saw it. And they were fighting for the rights of Englishmen and for the settlement of that Locke talked about in the Glorious Revolution. So they were trying to preserve what they saw as the existing system. And that really comes from the fact, we were able to do that because, especially in America, every one of the colonies had its own government that had been operating for up to 100 years. And I think Virginia has the House of Burgesses, as it was called, now the House of Delegates, I think is one of the oldest existing, like the third oldest continuously existing legislative body in the world, right? So, from since 1600 and something, we've had, a government where the people were managing their own affairs. So you had this sense that we've done this. This is traditional. We know how this works. We can keep on doing that. Whereas a lot of other places, the problem is they have two concepts. There's control or chaos, and there's the idea of how people manage their own affairs. They just don't have the experience with it, and they don't know what it means to live like that.
That's right. That's right. And in China, it's exactly that way. And so there was always this notion of keeping your blinders on, keeping your lane. You don't mess with the local authority. You don't challenge anybody. You stay with your job. You do it the best you can. If you can. If you can't, then, well, it's not my fault. It's that guy's fault. But you just don't look beyond your own lane. And so people are immensely tolerant, even of things that, you get in a taxi here, and if the cabbie finds out you speak Chinese, you'll get an earful about whatever their particular complaint is of the day. But would they want a change in the government? Absolutely not. Do they, what are their feelings about our current government? They love Xi Jinping. They may hate this or that or the other thing. And they love it, of course, when I criticize the U.S. government. But they're not, because it's not my business. Right? I'm going to stay in my lane. I'm going to study hard, work hard, and the rest is somebody else's department, and I hope they don't screw it up.
So the irony of this, though, is that you talked about how they've decided their big lesson of the fall of the Soviet Union is don't open up. But on the other hand, opening up is what they've been doing for the since 1978, 1979, and it's been, in many ways, it's been the key to their success. So the whole question here is, they're sort of flush with this success and the sense of power, and we're becoming equal to and stronger than the West and stronger than the United States. But at the same time, they're changing course back against the thing that made them powerful, the integration with the West and the opening up of more freedom.
That's absolutely correct. And unfortunately, they have is that the literal communist system didn't work. So they're not going to go back to actual communism. But what they've accepted as the replacement for that is basically a state-run fascist economy where you have profits and losses, and even state-owned enterprises have to make a profit, but it's heavily dominated by the government. They inject huge amounts of money into the system. The banking system is entirely government run. So there are no such things as private banks in China, as far as I'm aware of. They're all state-owned enterprises.
I remember hearing, though, that there actually are private banks that are done sort of in a black market
on the down
way,
yes.
And there were all sorts of problems with trying to figure out what was going on with that. You'd have people loaning money sort of on the side.
Well, I have a personal story about that. When we went to buy a car about 4 or 5 years ago now, you can get a car loan, and most people just pay cash, but we got a loan. But there's a kind of lag time, and I didn't quite understand the process entirely, but whatever is going on there's a lag time between when you get your loan approved. It's not like in the States where you walk into the dealership and they shuffle you from guy to guy and you drive home in your new car. We had to get a loan from the bank, but then to execute that loan, we had to have a sort of sub-loan from a private guy who then secured our loan with the bank, and then we could go get the car a month later or something. It was a long process. It was crazy. Well, that guy was not a true bank. He was a little private guy, and when we paid off our loan, we were supposed to get back the deposit we put down as security for our loan. Well, about 6 months before our deposit was due, they had made a bunch of other bad loans. And so as it was coming due and was supposed to come back to us, our loan was being fully paid off and so on, we got an invitation that we could get a free color TV in lieu of the $500 or whatever it was that we'd put down as a deposit on this loan. And my wife, of course, said, that's ridiculous. We don't want a color TV. And the person on the phone from this company said, listen to me, you really want to take the TV.
Because otherwise you're not getting anything at all.
Later, they were closed.
Yeah.
So they had made one of their bad loans was to a TV reseller. So they got a whole boatload of TVs and no money.
Yeah.
And, if we hadn't taken the TV, we weren't getting the cash back.
Right.
So, there is this huge black market in finance. And again, going back to our bigger topics, this is where you get with government control, right? If you want, on the one hand, government control, on the other hand, a vibrant economy, what do you have? You've got the gray or black market that fills in the gaps where the government isn't going to do it. So those things are rampant over here. Another example, if you want to invest money, there are no mutual funds in China that I'm aware of. The banks pay higher than the US, like 3% interest, but lower than inflation. Mm-hmm. The stock market is completely rigged and completely lacks transparency of any kind. You don't want to go there. So what do? There are these off-the-books investments that are paying 8, 9, 10%, and you have no idea what they're actually investing in. They're run through the bank, but not by the bank. They're gray market. So the bankers themselves are offering these little side investments. Many of them are basically Ponzi schemes, but you don't have the opportunity to invest in the way that you would in the US. So what do? If you want to make a return on investment, you go with the gray guys.
The gray guys, I like that. Well, that brings up a question, because I think there's this sense in America, and who's Friedman in the New York Times. For some reason, I can't remember his first name.
Tom Friedman.
Tom Friedman. Tom Friedman in the New York Times.
Generally astute commentator on China in some ways.
Oh yeah, he can be really brilliant, but he also has this like fascination with the idea that they're all engineers who are running it, and they're he has almost this envy for what if we elites here in America had the power just to impose what we see as the good and right solution.
Right.
And
absolutely.
There's this mythologizing of the Chinese system as being very efficient and very powerful, and the idea they're going to overcome us, they're going to overtake us any day now. And, I sort of see that as being a little short of the reality of how chaotic it's sort of like total control.
You might say that.
Total control in theory, and a lot of chaos and black market and things that are happening off the books in practice.
Absolutely, yes. And Tom Friedman suffers from the fact that when he comes here, he's a foreign dignitary. Right. So he comes to Hong Kong and Shenzhen, and they escort him through the Potemkin villages. Yeah. Which, I'm actually being inappropriately flip, because these are real things. The Shenzhen subway system is outstanding. Many of the things he remarks on are, in fact, legitimately good.
But he's seeing one side of things.
Exactly. And it's a country of 1.4 or 5 billion people by now. So, you can put together some really impressive things to look at. And I hear this, and I have to confess, when I came here, I was very open to the idea that the U.S. is in chaos. We've got rampant political correctness, and we've got rampant corruption, and maybe China has something going on that, philosophically I don't like it in some ways, but maybe their political system has something going for it. However, I don't know if I should be happy or unhappy that my philosophical priors, as they say, have been reinforced in my time here. What we see in China is, in fact, a remarkable thing. I mean, they have managed to pull off a true miracle in holding this system together, and they really have. Standards of living are growing, and they have grown since I've been here. Incontestably, I'm not talking about GDP numbers, which are questionable, and all those kinds of things. You see people's lives are definitely getting better year on year. However, there's incredible inefficiency in this country because of the system. Huge, and of course the notorious ghost towns where they build these acres and acres of high-rise towers. I used to drive to work every day, and about a 2-kilometer stretch, like what's that, a mile and a half or so,
right,
was this vast, beautiful, high-end, completely empty condo development. And the whole front row were these 3-story villas that should be selling for like $750,000, and not a light was on.
Mm-hmm.
The whole thing was completely wasted. So those, of course, are notorious. But what's not so notorious is just right outside this window, there's a tower on top of a gorgeous shopping mall that would be the envy of any American city, but the entire tower is empty. 25, 30 stories, empty. Every high-rise apartment building, condo building, I forget my English sometimes on these things where I don't speak them often. Some of these high-rise condo buildings, the entire ground floor is a single shop. So huge inefficiency, huge hotel construction, completely unused, empty. So there's that. Then there's also just the minor inefficiency. So for example, just general business practices. So every Chinese business leader is expected to have what they call a little secretary who does no actual work, but she's paid on the company payroll, and you can guess what her real job is.
Yeah.
And if he doesn't have one, that's like shameful. Who are you that you can't have a 25-year-old little secretary? And even just on the factory level, when I first came to China, I had a friend who was a Swedish guy, was a business consultant and an engineer. And he was doing work in a factory in Dalian. And he noticed, just as an ancillary thing, not part of his actual work, that they had arranged their production line so that the main line was this giant machine that vented the heat duct straight into the air conditioning intake. So they were wasting tens of thousands of dollars a year on wasted air conditioning, breakdowns in their air conditioning system, and it was a heat-sensitive process, so they had to have working AC. And he brought this to their attention, and the factory manager said, "It's working well enough. Who cares?" Right? Because they're protected by their government contact and connections. There's no competition, so they don't have to care about that. So it's just it's a really inefficient system. There are some great things about China. The number one thing that keeps China afloat, in my opinion, is the lack of a social safety net, which a lot of people want here, but that makes for relative mobility of capital and employment. You don't go home and collect unemployment for 6 months.
Yeah.
You go find where the next factory is hiring people. And so, for example, where I lived in Dalian, in about a 5-year period, lost a quarter of its population because the economy was slumping. So people would either go home or go to other parts of China where there were jobs. In the US, you don't have that mobility of labor.
Right. The labor that has to be mobile. So in other words,
right.
in the U.S., you get the people still in West Virginia waiting for the coal mines to reopen, or still in Pennsylvania waiting for the steel mills to reopen.
That's right. And there are different. I don't want to paint it as a great system. Of course, there are problems with that, and there are different barriers to mobility. For example, the housing prices. But here, in general, you can have massive mobility where, right, and if the U.S. were China, West Virginia would be empty.
Right. Well, so
and that's economically much more efficient than the U.S. way of doing things.
yeah, so one impression I have with China is that, you know, they've had this tremendous growth. It looks tremendous partly because they're going from such a small base that they were so crushed by Mao and the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. They were crushed to such a low level that just lifting the boot off their necks allows them to do this tremendous growth. But at the same time, if you look at their efficiency and the level at which they're operating relative to the West, if it's 1.5 billion people who have come up to a certain level, but they're not at the same level as Europe or the West.
That's right. The per capita economy is certainly not in any competition with what we're aware of. However, I do have to say that in fact, things have improved here tremendously economically. So the middle class in China lives really well. And if you walk across the street from here to the shopping mall, you'll see young, beautifully dressed people, and I don't know if they're actually buying the Rolexes in the Rolex shop, but they're sure looking at them, and there truly is real prosperity here. There is still crushing poverty. It's nothing like the poverty in other parts of the country, though. I've been to India a few times. I've been to Vietnam. I've been to Thailand, and those places have real poverty that truly does not exist in China today. So I don't want to minimize, even as I talk about the inefficiencies, I don't want to minimize what they have accomplished.
So the whole question, though, is can they maintain this while going back to Mao on the political level?
Well, and I do think that there are signs that that's not, they've held it together far longer than I thought they would. I have to own up to the fact that I have been predicting for 5 years now imminent collapse in the Chinese economy, and I'm a stopped clock. Someday I'll be correct, but I do think that recent events have shown that there's a real fragility, and they're trying to do the impossible. They're trying to move forward toward a middle-class economy, an information economy. They're pushing their internet services, WeChat, Alibaba, all these things, while at the same time maintaining this increasingly crushing repression of ideas. And I don't think you can hold that together forever. So, and I think the cracks are starting to show.
I'd like to end, though, on the thing is on a more positive note, which is, what are the things you find? I mean, obviously, you found things to love in China, and you've gotten married in China, so you found people to love there, too. And so what is it you find the most positive and promising things, not just politically, but culturally, about China?
Right. The Chinese people in general have a real look to the future, and despite all the history that we've talked about, they really are looking for their next best thing. It's an increasingly innovative country, and in some ways they have the benefit of not being the early adopters. So, we have our crumbling roads and our horrible airports and so on. Well, China doesn't have those things.
Yeah, I've heard they do things like leapfrog straight to cell phones and not have to build all the landline capacity.
That's right. There are huge areas where you can't get a landline. So there's tremendous innovation, tremendous opportunity here. And I have had a great time here, and I see tremendous business opportunities still. There's a dark cloud over that now that wasn't there before, and also maybe we can end with one key thing, which I think is an intangible, but it's absolutely crucial, and that is China and the U.S. share one thing in common, and that is an incredible sense of national pride and a kind of exalted sense of their place in the world.
Yeah, sort of a manifest destiny.
Very much so, yeah. And they, for 150 years, like if you imagine an old Charles Atlas ad where the kid's getting sand kicked in his face,
right,
and then he buffs up. Well, imagine that in reverse. He was the buff guy and then goes to getting sand kicked in his face. Understandably, they had a really, really bad 150 years, strong and powerful and important. And I think that has its downsides, of course, but I also think it's a tremendously positive thing. That's the one thing that will keep them from sliding into, for example, a Russia kind of situation, or Africa. If things get bad here, the Chinese people will not tolerate mediocrity.
Well,
that to me is the most admirable quality.
Yeah, I've thought for a long time that, we could talk about the different policy things, the different policies you should adopt and shouldn't adopt, but one of the keys to success for a country is simply wanting it more than you want, revenge, or wanting it more than you want to be politically correct. Simply wanting the prosperity, wanting to advance and to grow. And that will
absolutely
cover up for a lot of other failures.
Mr. Japanese businessman comes to China to set up a factory. Yeah. Do I say, what about Nanjing?
Right.
No, I say thank you.
Right.
So, maybe that's going to fester in the background. It's going to infect that relationship. But bottom line is they want to succeed. And I think they will succeed. I do foresee in the short term some tough times for China, but I think China has nothing but greatness in its future long term.
Well, thanks so much for having me on, for coming on. My guest today is Bob Garmong, a teacher and consultant, and someone who's lived in China for how many years now?
Almost 10 years. It'll be 10 years in February.
All right. So thanks again for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I am that dreaded thing, the old China hand, and this is one of my favorite topics to discuss. I could go for forever, as you know. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, maybe we'll do it again sometime as more developments come. Sure. If you find this conversation interesting, you can find more ideas and analysis at the Tracinski Letter, tracinskiletter.com. Please follow our YouTube channel, follow our podcast, and of course you can support us at Patreon, patreon.com/Salon of the Refused. This is Salon of the Refused. I'm Rob Tracinski. Thank you for listening.